Hello everybody and welcome back to another Warframe video. You better take a seat. This one's gonna get a little weird. I'm gonna be talking about a weapon that barely anyone seems to have heard of. It's a proper tactical nuke that you can fit in your pocket, and whenever I seem to take into missions, I always end up either killing myself or getting a question about what that weapon actually is. Usually both. Either way, this is going to be a pretty interesting one, and this weapon has a lot of quirks, and I'm going to try and go through all of them. And while I'm sure there are a million ways to build this weapon, it's kind of resource intensive to actually get this weapon to a place which makes it good, so I'm just going to be looking at the build which I found works for me after a couple of months of testing a little while ago. Let's jump into this. But this particular weapon isn't a weapon, it's actually an arcane. It's called Exodia Contagion, and with most Exodias, you'd expect to be able to buy it from Hawk and Cetus and equip it onto a modular melee weapon called a Zor. However, this one is event exclusive. It came out with Plaguestar, and the event comes round about twice a year. D aren't very good at timekeeping though, so expect it at very, very strange intervals. Either way, it costs about 10,000 standing per arcane, and with every arcane, you need about 10 of them, so when the event finally comes around again, you'd better get ready to grind for this thing. Back in the Orbiter, let's take a little look at what this arcane does. So with most arcanes, they either give you a stat buff or give you some kind of extra utility sort of ability. So it seems strange that one would actually be dealing damage for you. And as you can probably read from the description, after you bullet jump or double jump, you can melee while aim gliding to do an air attack, which is going to launch a projectile that explodes when it hits something. The projectile has a pretty weird arc, and ranking up the Exodia doesn't actually change the projectile, it instead gives it a multiplicative damage buff after it travels 30 meters in the air. Rank 1 you get a 200% damage increase, rank 2 you get 300, and rank 3 you get 400%. So remember, that's not an increase to base damage, that's an increase to overall damage, which is powerful, but 30 meters is a much longer distance than you would expect. Obviously though, there's a lot of information left out of this, which I'm gonna try and cover now. And as we do with most testing, we head to the Simulacrum. So this weapon is completely unmodded, and we'll talk about the parts that I use for the Zor in a second, along with a lot of other stuff that we'll talk about in a second. And the best way to demonstrate is just to show you. So here we go. We double jump, aim glide, and throw. And you'll see that we threw a projectile. You can also do that by bullet jumping. Aim glide, and melee. And we throw that projectile. Now, as for the multiplicative damage buff that we get after 30 meters, I think it was, let's head over here. Pop a marker over there. You can see that's over 30 meters, and let's chuck it. And you might have noticed that in midair, just before the explosion, it flashed a bit. That indicated that you got the damage buff. But what does the projectile actually do? Well, the best way to show it is just to take it up against some enemies. So here we've got some level 100 grenade units. This weapon is completely unmodded. Let's just throw it. So we can already sort of see a number of things. First of all, there's a guaranteed impact proc whenever you hit an enemy with it. But you might have also noticed some blast procs, some puncture procs, and you will have also probably noticed that some enemies get viral procs by it. And that's because this projectile has its own spread of damage. Now, I'm not 100% on how the damage is spread out, but from what I can tell, it takes the physical damage types from your Zor, but then also adds some of its own viral damage, and potentially some blast damage, but that blast damage only occurs when the projectile which gets lodged in the ground finally explodes. Like that. Now, it's pretty annoying to test this weapon from here. We know it takes the physical damage types from your weapon, adds a bit of viral in there, does some guaranteed impact procs, can proc blast when it explodes. How are mods affecting this thing? Well, let's take a look. So the first thing I want to point out is how attack speed affects this weapon. So you'll notice we've got no mods, just the Exodia Contagion. Now let's pop a primed Fury on there, and have a look at how the projectile reacts now. As you can see, we get a much faster fly through the air, so not only has our air attack speed increased, we also have a greater projectile speed increase. And this speed of the projectile is also affected by the base speed of your Zor, so it might be starting to shape up to you how the physical damage stats and the attack speed are implemented into this Exodia, how you might want to start building a Zor around this Exodia to get the stats that you want. And that brings me on to my next point, how elemental damage types and any kind of supplementary stats such as status or critical hits are implemented onto this weapon. So if we place, let's say, Fever Strike and Molten Impact onto this weapon, it's going to make gas. Now let's see if we can proc any gas when we throw this. And sure enough, there are the gas procs, taking that damage away. And that's sort of the basis of how I found out how good this weapon can be. And gas procs, I think, really do make this weapon shine. I've seen some people build it for crits, some people build it for like some corrosive procs, have sort of a corrosive proc that you can lob out when you're using another weapon. But for me, it is gas procs all the way, and that's really because of the multipliers that they could take advantage of. And I should probably start a list of multipliers on the side of the screen, because it's gonna get a little bit convoluted. So when you apply a gas proc, it will inflict toxin damage and toxin procs in an AoE around the proc of gas. So if you have an AoE weapon that applies procs of gas, you have an AoE of AoEs of toxin procs. A little bit of a tongue twister. And the damage that these toxin procs do is a little bit strange. So it gets a little bit of its damage from the base damage that your weapon deals, so that is the damage that it deals after plus damage multipliers, but it gets most of its damage from the toxin damage on your weapon. So any plus toxin damage that you modded onto it is going to increase the damage of your toxin procs that you inflict from gas by a whole lot. The problem is that there aren't a whole lot of ways to get toxin damage, so the strategy is to increase your base damage by as much as possible so that when you do mod on that toxin damage, you will get the most out of it, because elemental damage increases are based on your base damage, and the plus damage increases applied to it. So heading over to the mod screen, these are the mods that I've got set up here. So I have Primed Pressure Point for increased base damage, which is going to increase the amount of toxin damage we managed to mod onto it. I have Primed Fever Strike and Virulent Scourge for plus toxin. Then I have Virulent Scourge and Volcanic Edge to make gas, because you need a little bit of heat damage on there to turn that toxin into gas, even though heat damage isn't going to affect the damage of our toxin procs at all. And the status chance is really important because we preferably don't want to be throwing a dud anytime we throw this. Having plus toxin is also pretty important because we need to weigh our damage severely towards gas, because physical damage types count for 4 times their actual listed damage when it comes to deciding what proc you get. So for example, when deciding what proc we would get if we managed to proc status chance with our current sheet stats, we would have 1500 damage going towards gas, but even though there's only 237 slash damage, when deciding what proc we get, that counts as 4 times that amount, so somewhere around the 950 damage sort of mark, which is kind of damning because it means that you do have about a third chance to not proc gas. And slash is nice, but not what we're looking for. Bear in mind that this weapon's projectile also has innate viral damage, which will dilute our procs even more, so stacking toxin damage on there is not only important for getting the procs that we want, but it's also important to increase the damage of the toxin procs our gas procs are going to inflict. Next up, I have Primed Fury, because Primed Fury makes that projectile speed increase, and I built this saw in such a way that it's going to end up being slow. We'll get onto that in just a second. Next, I have Proton Snap, and Proton Snap gives us more toxin damage and more status chance when we wall latch, and this is going to synergize really well with something else we have. I have a Riven mod in here to give us more toxin damage and more heat damage to weigh our procs and give us more toxin damage. And finally, I have a Faction Damage mod, and this is a weird multiplier with gas procs. So when you get a toxin proc from your gas proc, the damage given by a smite mod or a bane mod, depending on which weapon you're using, will be applied once to your gas damage, but then twice to the toxin procs inflicted by it. So it's actually a 30% with another 30% damage increase added onto it, and the 30% damage increase is multiplicative of your total damage, not just your base damage. So this is actually really strong since it stacks twice, but it doesn't stack twice, it actually stacks 3 times, because we're going to be using this weapon with an invisibility frame. So when you're invisible with a melee weapon, you get a 700% additive damage increase to your base damage, and that is obviously going to affect the amount of damage that our toxin procs do, because our toxin damage that we modded onto this weapon is based on our base damage. Now, with this stealth damage increase, our smite mod is also added onto our damage by our toxin procs a third time. So our multipliers currently stand at a whole bunch of toxin damage, 3 smite mods worth of damage increase, and a 700% stealth damage increase. But it does not end there. Oh no, it doesn't. But before we get onto our final multiplier, I'd just like to point out the parts that I used to make this saw, because I really wanted to optimize maximum status chance and maximum base damage. I used a Quana 2 Ruhang to get as much status chance as we possibly could, as well as increasing our base damage, and I used a Scythe Strike and a Stun Grip just because that was what gave us the most base damage. I didn't really care about attack speed since Primed Fury was going to make up the difference. So our final damage multiplier is the Arcane Arachne Arcane. Let me just take off my Arcane helmet here. And now we can equip a second Arcane Arachne. Now, Arcane Arachne is one of those arcanes that is oddly specific and people tend not to care about it. It gives you a multiplicative damage increase for 20 seconds upon wall latching for 2 seconds. And that's pretty helpful for us because Proton Sap also procs on wall latch for 2 seconds. And of course, this multiplicative damage buff counts for our melee damage. And while I'm not sure about if we get an additional smite stack with this, I highly doubt it. So we have another damage multiplier here for our gas procs. So we are stacking a lot of damage here, and the suspense is sort of killing me, so let's just see how this performs. So since we had a Smite Corrupted mod on here, I'm going to be using some Corrupted Heavy Gunners at max level, of course, and I have their AI paused because having their AI paused does inflict the stealth melee damage multiplier, and in a normal situation you would be using a stealth frame like Loki to go invisible, or a CC frame because some CC can also disable enemies and give you that stealth damage multiplier. But just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to leave their AI paused because it gives us the same effect as being invisible, just in a much more controlled environment. So, standing from a good distance of 30 meters back, which we are at, let's wall latch for 2 seconds, and watch up in the right hand corner of the screen, we proc Arcane Arachne and Proton Snap, and let's just get to work. Yep. That is some pretty ridiculous damage. Bear in mind, these are level 160 Corrupted Heavy Gunners, some of the heaviest armored, highest HP enemies that you can get in the game, being one-shot by this weapon. Now, I can understand thinking that the setup for this weapon is a little bit too convenient, like you wouldn't get this situation in a normal mission, but I don't actually think that's the case. Being invisible just requires you to have an invisibility frame, and while you're invisible, you can wall latch to your heart's content and you won't die because enemies can't see you. So you have plenty of time to proc your arcanes and your Proton Snap, and then get to work throwing your projectile out. There is only one downside to this weapon, which I would recommend you observe, and it's something which this weapon is quite notorious for in the groups of people that actually do care about weirdly obscure weapons like this. And as with most good AoE weapons, it's that it has fucking stealth damage. Goddamn stealth damage. And it's really bad. I mean, if I threw this over here, I would probably still get hit by it. The explosion radius is big, like really big. And that can be damning to this weapon in smaller corridor type tile sets, especially with the fact that to make the most out of it, you have to throw it that 30 meters to get the damage multiplier. So, would I recommend that you build this weapon? Probably not. The stars sort of do have to align for you to make the most out of it. I mean, you need the perfect rhythm, you need some really obscure mods, you need to wait for the Plague Star event to come around to actually get this arcane at all, and it's quite a grind to get all 10 of them to make it max rank, not to mention having to get Arcane Arachne and limiting your frame choices to only frames that can go invisible. But I think if you're into obscure weapons that are just sort of make people question what you're using when you're in multiplayer games, and really just want something which can be incredibly broken in the right situations, I would totally say this is a good long-term project. After all, if you're struggling to find things to do in the game, what better thing to do to occupy your time than spend hours testing a really, really strange arcane that no one has touched since it was nerfed back in 2017. If you're still watching this video, thank you so much for sticking with me, talking about one of my weirdest obsessions in Warframe. I have loved this weapon for so long, it's by far my most used melee weapon, and it isn't even really a melee weapon. Now, please do excuse me while I get crushed by a thumper. Thanks for watching.